to this webinar. It's the Doctoral College webinar series, and we hope that what we'll do throughout the course of this semester is that we'll provide you with some guidance and some insights into how you can become, if you like, a more effective PhD researcher. So what I'm going to do is just to start with this presentation. If at any stage that you have anything that you'd like to say, then please, unmute your microphone and do so, and turn on your camera. If you want to wait until the end of the presentation, that's all the better, and then we can have a discussion about this. So I'll start off just by talking about the whole issue of secret becoming a successful PhD researcher. So I've just listed, if you like, some insights, or what I hope will be some tips for you to follow with regard to your own PhD. And obviously a lot will depend on the kind of stage that you're at with regard to your own PhD. So I look forward very much to your input in this. That's a really essential part of any webinar that we do, hearing from you and hearing your thoughts and your feedback. And also it would be great if you didn't want to intervene during the presentation itself, if you could put any information in the chat box, that would be great. Okay, so I'm going to start just by saying secrets to becoming a successful PhD researcher. So obviously this will not apply to all of you who are here today, but for some of you, I would say it's really important to select a topic early and to pick a research topic you're passionate about. So why pick a research topic you're passionate about? I think why this is so critical is because for everyone doing a PhD, no matter how brilliant you are, how much you love the research that you're doing, there is inevitably going to be a point where your enthusiasm will diminish somewhat. And to get yourself over that particular trough, it's really important that that the subject you are doing is something that really piques and tweaks your interest, because without that, it's going to be difficult to get over that stage. If you resent and begin to really dislike the topic you're doing, it's going to be very difficult to get over that. So think about something that you're passionate about, and it's really important that, when you do have it selected, that you do it early, and then, if you like, narrow down the focus of that particular topic. So I'd say having a passion and enthusiasm for your subject is really important. And even your passion is something that can grow as you throughout your PhD. But as I say, there will be a point, it's almost where your enthusiasm will just begin to decline somewhat. It's really important that you have something that you're passionate about. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that in a little while. Obviously, again, this may not be applicable to some of you, but I thought it was really, I would put it in there just to choose a supervisor with a good record, good research record in your field. That's really important. And we could talk for a long time about how the supervisor relationship the relationship you have with your supervisor or your supervisory team is perhaps the most important relationship you'll have while you're doing your thesis. Okay, I'll go on to the next one. So I would say it's really important also to be familiar with their research and their methodological expertise. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to uncritically follow the pathway that your supervisor has taken with regard to their own research or their own methodology or their own theoretical framework, whatever it may be. It's important. Something we'll talk about later on in this webinar is just the importance of developing your own researcher identity, and that is really critical, just having a strong researcher identity of your own. And many PhD candidates find this quite difficult to, if you like, from the I won't say necessarily from the shadow of your supervisor, but just stepping away from or outgrowing your supervisor in terms of their research. They will have expertise up to a point in your area, but you are the one who will be the leading expert in that particular niche area that you're doing by the time your PhD is concluded. So you will find possibly quite likely actually that your relationship with your supervisor will evolve and possibly change throughout the duration of your PhD. I mean that from a researcher perspective, that at the beginning it's likely that you will be, that the supervisor will be the person with the expertise in your area, but by the end of the PhD, you will be the person who will be the leading expert in your in that particular niche area that you were undertaking your research in. So that's important also about your. But I think it's important to become familiar with the research, because that will then help you just in terms of understanding their style and their kind of the methodologies that they use. I think it will give you just a better understanding of the approach that your supervisor has. I would also say it's just important that you try at the beginning, this is particularly at the beginning of your PhD. I'll talk about things that are more relevant to those of you who are, further into your PhD very shortly. But I'd say it's just good, it's really good practice to develop, if you like, a training and career development plan. You can do that with us in the Doctoral College. We have a lot of services and facilities here now to help you along with that, and also with your supervisor or your supervisory team. Really important, I think, just to think about what kind of training would you like to do to develop yourself as a researcher or in terms of your career. So I'd say think about what skills perhaps that you would like to develop, or what skills you feel you may be lacking in, and just think about, what kind of plan would you like to have to develop and enhance those skills, and look at what's available here in the Doctoral College, or with Human Resources, where they now have a research and development program for PhD candidates, or with library services, or with career services, where they do excellent training for people who are PhD candidates also. So think about those training and career development plans, because you'll find that it's really important at the end of your PhD that you're able to articulate the kinds of skills that you have. You'll have a huge amount of skills just by virtue of doing a PhD in itself. You'll acquire skills that you never perhaps thought about. One of the most important of those, I would say, is that you by the end of the PhD, you'll be an excellent project manager. Now, you probably didn't think of yourself as a project manager, and probably don't go around thinking that you are, that you have the skills or capacities to be a project manager. But you have to think of it that what you have done is that you've come up with you have evolved that idea in terms of a proposal. You've brought that to a group if you like, through an assessment process. You've then been, you've worked on enhancing and developing further that proposal into an actual thesis. You've dealt with risks, you've dealt with milestones, you've dealt with deliverables, as clinical as that sounds in terms of a PhD. But that's all of those things you are dealing with. So you're dealing with risk mitigation, because throughout your PhD, you will have things which will derail you along the way, be it financial pressures, be it family pressures. By the time you bring your thesis to conclusion, it is fair to say that you will have developed a huge amount of techniques which are synonymous with project management. I know that may not be to everyone's taste, that idea, but it's good to think of it like that. You are a project manager. Your thesis is your project. And again, I don't mean to make your thesis sound mechanical or anything like that, but that is effectively, what you are at the end of your thesis. When I did my PhD, I never ever thought of myself as a project manager, but looking back on it, that's what you're doing. You're bringing a project through to from conceptualization stage all the way through to your graduations, to the final stage. You're analyzing your findings, you're engaged in data collection. There are so many things that you are doing and doing concurrently, that you really are, by the end of it, a really good project manager. So that's one of those skills that you develop as a PhD researcher that perhaps you're not necessarily aware of right now, but it is something that you can use afterwards when you talk about, you know, if you are in in an interview where you're talking about the skills that you have or that you have enhanced throughout your PhD. Project manager is actually a really important one. There's totally a whole myriad of skills that you have developed and enhanced throughout your PhD, but we'll talk about those throughout the course of this webinar series. Also, another thing I would say that's important, just when you're working with your supervisor, just have realistic expectations of your supervisor, because sometimes your supervisor may have a different expectation of the amount of time and the amount of feedback that they're going to give to you. So it's always good to decide in advance, to sit down with your supervisor and decide, okay, what's our plan for this, you know, for this thesis? How often should we meet? And how much feedback should be given? Now, obviously, it depends on your discipline. You're going to be meeting your supervisor in some disciplines almost on a daily basis, be it in a laboratory or in other settings. But for some of you, you may be tentative and a little bit insecure about approaching your supervisor to meet with you on a regular basis, to get feedback from them on a regular basis. So it's always good in advance to think, you know, to speak to your supervisor and say, how often should we meet? How often can I expect feedback? And is it okay if I send you perhaps the notes of my meeting with you, so that you can verify that this is what we have discussed and this is the next step that I have to take in my PhD. So, but you have the supervisor as someone for whom your thesis, you know, your thesis is perhaps the most important thing to you right now in your life. For your supervisor, while your thesis is important, it's not always going to be the most important element of your supervisor's life. So think about it like that, you know, your supervisor will be able to allocate a certain amount of time to you, but don't think that you can just, you know, turn up and go into your supervisor's office unannounced. It's always good in advance to have a plan in place with your supervisor. Okay, this is advice which I got after I finished my PhD, and I was thinking, I was at a workshop and I heard a supervisor say this, that what he said he does with all of his PhD candidates is he tells them to write to the research question and try to write every day. Okay, writing every day, it's not always going to be possible, but try to write to the research question is really important. So what this supervisor said, he advised all his PhD researchers to do is to write out what the research question was, to stick it to their laptop or perhaps to the wall of the area in which they were working, or the corral or cubicle or wherever it was, and just have the research question there every day, because it helps give you a focus. I always think of the research question, it's like your Polaris, it's like your North Star. It's what's going to guide you in terms of what you're writing. When I started my PhD, I began to read everything I could get my hands and eyes on with regard to the topic. And I found that developing a research question began to drift away from me. I began to find I had so much information that I was finding it really difficult to come up with a coherent research question, even though I had a research question in my proposal. But your research question is something which kind of evolves. It's an iterative process. It's something which you develop and you hone throughout the course of your PhD. So write, I would say, to the research question. Think about what your research is. Have it, you know, attached to your laptop. Have it somewhere where you can look at it while you're writing, because that will really help you to focus on what it is that you're trying to do. Because if you don't focus on the research question, the whole subject matter of your PhD could become just overwhelming and very difficult to deal with. So I thought, after I heard that advice, I thought, wow, that's beautifully simple. You know, just write to the research question. And I thought it was just one of the best pieces of advice anyone could ever get. Okay. Also, again, and you know, it can be difficult to do this, but try to treat your PhD as a job. So think of it as I just mean about that in terms of the hours that you allocate and dedicate to your PhD. So why I say treat your PhD as a job, just try and get into a kind of disciplinary framework where you're a framework of discipline where you treat your PhD as a job. So this will ensure you can focus on the tasks that you have to do as your PhD. So that is your PhD. So think of it as, have a timetable that you try to adhere to, and just make sure that you complete or try to complete certain tasks, be it on a weekly or on a daily basis, that you can say, well, these are my achievements for this week. This is what I've tried to do. But to think of it as more like a job than being, I don't like the term PhD student. I always think of you as PhD researchers or PhD candidates. So because you're very different from undergraduate students or even from, top master students, it's a very different. Doctoral research is, very different, I would say. So I think it's important that you try to treat your PhD as a job. I know that's not going to be possible for everyone to do it on a daily basis, but it is important that you have, self-discipline with regard to the hours that you allocate to your PhD during the week. Another thing I would say is just try to become socialized to the research culture of your faculty and department. And again, we use this term research culture a lot, and maybe we're not always, aware of what research culture entails. But I would say, the research, I would say to look at your faculty, look at the kind of research that's taking place, look at the kind of publications that people in your faculty or in your department are aiming at. Think about what it is that you think about the kind of research culture that's there in terms of, say, how much of their time is, do faculty members dedicate to research? Speak to faculty members and to your supervisor about, what kind of research plans that they have. Do they have plans for, three or more publications per year, for example, or what kind of journals are they trying to get published in, or do they look at journals in terms of their impact, and where do they think you should be aiming for? What kind of journals do they think you should be trying to get published in? That all helps you to get just inculcated into the research culture of your faculty or of your department. And your faculty or your department should also, provide, a certain amount of training or events that help you become socialized into that research culture, to become more familiar with the research culture that's prevailing in your department or in your faculty. And again, as a part of that, I think it's important to build and maintain professional relationships with faculty members, also with your fellow postgraduate researchers or PhD candidates, and with recent graduates. And again, that all helps you to just become aware, if you like, of the research culture within your department. But you'll know it's so important to build those relationships and those friendships with your other PhD candidates, but also with faculty members and perhaps with PhD graduates from your department or faculty or school. Also, a good way of developing yourself as a researcher. And again, this is all tied into finding your voice as a doctoral scholar, which I'll come to in a short while. This is about to look for opportunities to engage in publication or getting your research out into the wider academic community. So look for opportunities to co-author either with your supervisor or with faculty colleagues, or perhaps with people that you meet at conferences who are very interested in your research. It's really good, if you can co-author a paper with people who are established in your field already. There are always kind of negotiations about, who's going to be the first author or how much work is undertaken on a collaborative paper. But it's really good to just look for opportunities to engage in co-authorship of publications, you know, with people in your faculty, with your school, with your unit, or with your supervisors and members of your supervisory team. Again, you know, you could say that this is perhaps the best tip of all when you're doing a PhD. If I was to say one thing about, you know, what is the most important characteristic of a PhD candidate, I wouldn't say genius, or, you know, I wouldn't say great intelligence or talent. All of those things are important, but, you know, everyone who does a PhD is a very intelligent person. I would say, just, you know, you're all talented, highly talented people, gifted people as well in so many instances. But the most important thing I would say to anyone doing a PhD, the most important characteristic to have is persistence. It's how you keep going when you deal with setbacks. A lot of people who do a PhD may not be familiar with setbacks, or with rejection, or with, for example, you know, not having something published in a journal, or not getting funding for a particular project, or it may be the case that they present something to their supervisor that their supervisor deems should be, you know, somewhat could be improved upon quite radically. And it, for many PhD candidates, dealing with this kind of rejection is the first time in their lives that they've come across an instance where their work isn't good enough, or it's deemed not to be good enough by members of the academy. And this can be really demoralizing for quite a number of people. So it's very important as a PhD researcher that you have the that you I won't say embrace rejection, but that you can expect it along the way. But it's how you recover from that, how you bounce back after those, after things like experiments go wrong, or you find it very difficult to, you know, with your data collection, or someone withdraws from a study, or you've done a lot of work with a particular participant in your research, and you find that they have withdrawn their consent to be included in the study. So things like that can really have a demoralizing effect on people. So that's doing a PhD. So that's why, you know, persistence is vital. Hopefully none of those things will ever happen to you, but it's just a really important thing. Sometimes I think in Harvard now that they teach a course on grit, just about like which is kind of almost like form of human resilience, if you like, just about how you can deal with setbacks, deal with rejection, overcome obstacles, and keep going on, even though you may have, you know, as I said earlier, you may have lost your enthusiasm and your passion for your subject. So to complete a PhD, persistence is vital. And this is increasingly recognized as a really important facet, or if you like, we can call it a skill or competence that people have. Really important that, you know, to finish your PhD. When I see people graduating with a PhD, I always think, you know, fantastic, is a wonderful achievement. But I'm always aware that the people who are graduating have gone through a lot in terms of the kind of obstacles that they've had to overcome, that there are a lot of things in the way. They're under, you know, financial pressures, family pressures. They might be here, you know, a long way from home doing a PhD, maybe finding the journey very lonely and frustrating. So I'm always so full of admiration for PhD graduates when I see them up there on the podium in the concert hall, because you really do get a sense that this is, you know, it's a wonderful academic achievement, but it's also a wonderful personal achievement for the people who are graduating, because it just demonstrates just incredible, you know, mental fortitude and resilience among the people gaining a doctorate. Okay, so just to be more less, if you like, technical about certain things, this is something that's also fundamental for anyone doing a PhD, is how to master, try and master the literature. And during the course of this webinar series, we'll talk also about doing a literature review, but that's taken as a given that you try and master the literature. Of course, back when I started my PhD many years ago, I remember that the literature was quite limited in the area that I was doing. Now you have an incredible choice with online publications, with people presenting their research almost on the day that they have finished, say, almost that they have the speed. Sorry, I'll reframe that. The speed with which research that's undertaken is now in published form can be very quick indeed, particularly with when you look at the number of open access publications that are there. So you see more and more research that's undertaken, it's now published quite quickly and it's published, can be published quite quickly after it's undertaken, and then it's up on the it's up on the internet. You don't have to go through the process of, say, interlibrary loans. You don't have to go to a different library to look for the literature. It's there at the touch of your finger. So you sometimes have a bewildering amount of literature to master, and that's why it's very good to use something like, say, to use software such as, for example, Connected Papers, and I can talk about that later. It's just really, really useful software to help you with your literature review, and just to help you with, in terms of helping you to master the literature. It's also important as a PhD researcher that you keep up to date with all the approaches, with statistical methods, with what might call evolving areas in your field. It's really important, because the more you can keep up to date with approaches and new research that's coming out, the better. As I said, this can be overwhelming at times to keep up to date with the research, with the approaches. It doesn't mean you have to read everything in your field. It just means that you have to be aware of and try to read, certain samples or examples of new approaches and evolving areas in your particular field or your particular discipline. Again, just to come back to publications, really good to have a plan for multiple publications. If you're thinking particularly of an academic career, you will need to have publications while you're doing your PhD. If you are doing what we call an article-based PhD, sometimes people call this PhD by publication, where you're amassing a number of publications together, or you're preparing a number of papers for publication, it's really important to have a plan in place, for multiple publications while you're doing your PhD. So again, if it's an academic career you're after, it's indispensable. It's just absolutely fundamental that you have publications throughout your PhD. But also, if you're doing a article-based PhD, you will need a plan in place for publications throughout the course of your doctoral studies. Again, just to come back to something I was talking about earlier, just about your identity as a researcher, because you'll find this is so common with PhD candidates, the whole thing about uncertainty. And again, uncertainty is not something that should be seen as a negative. Uncertainty is something that happens with every PhD researcher. We hear a lot about imposter syndrome as well, because a lot of PhD candidates are perfectionists. So finding your voice as a scholar is one of the most important things you can do as a PhD researcher. And why I would say that is that I've seen a number of theses come back on occasion, not often, but I've seen external examiners' reports in which they say that it would, while this is a great thesis, it would really have helped if the scholar had found their own voice, because it said, just a couple of reports that I've read have said that the scholar is obviously, you know, a gifted candidate, but they just didn't come out from the shadow of the great experts in the field. So that's why, as a PhD candidate, this, you know, you are now a creator of new knowledge, and you're doing, you know, research which hasn't been done before. And that should really help you to find your voice as a scholar. That's why it's important to go to conferences, to network with as many people as you can, so that you can share what your research is about. But also, you know, a lot of people find that very difficult to make that step over from being, if you like, you know, an absorber of knowledge to a creator of new knowledge, because it is a difficult journey, no doubt about it. You know, PhD is a hard thing to do. So that's why it's really, you know, it's really important that you find your voice as a scholar, that you know, I talked earlier about the evolving relationship between yourself and your supervisor. And again, this is where, you know, at the beginning, where your supervisor is the expert, but by the end of it, by the end of your thesis, that you will be the expert. You certainly should be the expert in that area that you're studying. So that is why it's really important that you find your voice as a scholar, and you will do, but sometimes it's just a question of self-confidence. But you should definitely, by the end of your PhD, certainly have a strong researcher identity that sets you apart from others in the field. Okay. Yes, again, just what I said earlier, attend important conferences and network. It's really good in that way. It just helps you in terms of collaboration. You find out about others' research. It's a great opportunity for you to see the reaction to your research, to see what other people think about it, whether they want to collaborate with you as well. And really, really important just to meet other people in your field with similar research interests. And it's like not just a confidence boost, but conferences can give a great boost to your research as well, because and give you just the enthusiasm to come back and then to work on your research further. Just great to give you ideas to help you to crystallize what it is that you are doing. I would say also, you know, funding is one of the most fundamental things for a PhD researcher. So difficult for people to undertake a PhD without funding, and even the amount of funding that you have will never really be sufficient to help you, you know, get through a PhD without having to seek part-time work or other kinds of work. So that's why it's important that you use every opportunity to seek funding. So if you hear of some seed funding or some grant or just anything at all which can help you with enhancing your financial circumstances, then you should certainly avail of it. And if it's linked to your research, then all the better, obviously. Just in case you're looking at a funding opportunity, just come back to this slide for one moment. So if you're in the stages of perhaps writing we'll call it like a research grant or research, or if you're writing an application looking for funding and you don't get the requisite funding, what you will find is that your reapplication, if you're looking for funding from another source, you can use a huge amount of that of that submission that you made when you're seeking funding again. So that's why I would say that a resubmission is the easiest funding application you will ever write. What I mean by that is you've written a research application, you haven't got the funding, but another funding opportunity comes up. Therefore, you can use a great deal of the original application to make a second application. So it's always good to make an application, make a funding application, get feedback on it, see what you can do to improve it, and then another funding opportunity will come up at some stage, and then you can use that resubmission. You can use that, or the majority of that text, as a resubmission for a funding application. And as I say here, a research submission is the easiest funding application you will ever write. Okay, just something I suppose that we don't always think about, because, you know, I mentioned about project management, a lot of those technical PhD, and that could sound very cold and clinical. But one of the great skills that we have as humans is our ability, to engage in our ability to articulate our ideas and to speak. So, if you think of, say, for example, that take ancient Greece, ancient Rome, rhetoric was the most prized skill among among people in the public eye. So politically, for senators and for other politicos, having the great skill of rhetoric was of oratory was the most important skill they could have, because politics was all about, you couldn't convince people through the written word. You had to convince people of your ideas through your rhetorical, how you framed your ideas as rhetoric. So they developed a whole range of, if you look at the whole art of rhetoric, or rhetoric as a skill, you can see that there are all kinds of ideas or all kinds of concepts within that. Things like anaphora and tricolon, all these various rhetorical devices that politicians use in particular. And this goes back to the whole tradition of Cicero in the Roman Empire about how to frame a speech and how to use particular devices. For example, like Martin Luther King was brilliant at using devices such as and what was it called, anatomasia, which would say things like, that that is by talking about something, but not referring, but talking about something, but saying that is not what is important. He would say things like, the greatness of this country is not in our buildings or in our industries. Our greatness is within the people. Something like that. Or a really good example is, say, Barack Obama, who would use the whole skill of what we call tricolon. It's repeating a phrase 3 times at the beginning of a sentence, and then changing the context of it. A very, very effective device. I just bring in those examples just to tell you, about rhetoric as a skill, because, and I'm not trying to be intimidating here or to make you frightened about this, but in your thesis, it's also important to remember that you are telling a story. So you're telling a story about your research. You're telling a story about how you, came to develop it and evolve it, and how this thesis grew along the way. And the evidence of it will be there. And no matter what the subject or how technical it is, it's always it's so important to have a convincing narrative to your thesis. Another piece of good advice that I heard many years ago was, be kind to your examiners. Don't make your examiners feel that they are, that this is really hard work reading your research. So your research should flow. Ideally, with a brilliant thesis, the words should just the words should almost be like the words should sing almost, if that makes any sense. But that can be very difficult to do. But I would say that, writing a convincing narrative is very, very important. And just having a good story, making your examiners feel that they want to get to the next page, that this is very, very interesting. It doesn't mean that you use any gimmicks or anything like that, but it just means that you remember you are telling a story, and you do need to have a strong narrative in your thesis, because you are writing at doctoral level, and it is expected that you are really, really capable and articulate in the way you get your ideas across. Now, for a lot of people, what amazes me really is to see people for whom English is not their first language and writing a convincing narrative in English. I'm always fascinated by how people can do that so well, and how many people can do that so well. And again, this can be very difficult. There's a lot of research to show, particularly for international researchers, just about the lack of confidence people have in articulating themselves in a language that is not a native language. There's not a first language for them. So that's much trickier. And one of the great, if you like, aspects of uncertainty in a PhD is using academic language, because when we're doing a PhD, it's the first time, perhaps for a lot of us, that we're using language that is very, very alien, if you like, to the way that we use language on a daily or even a daily basis, or even as we use at undergraduate level. I would also say writing a PhD is a social process, and trying to communicate your research to non-specialist, non-expert audience is hugely important, particularly if you're getting funding, public funding. It's really important that you're able to share that, to communicate that, because think about it, you want to show that your PhD is of some kind of social benefit, that it's not simply, an academic exercise that you're participating in for its own sake. You want to show, that how you can, that it has some, tangible benefit within and beyond academia. Also, yes, like I said earlier, try and identify the skills that you'd like to have for your future employment and try to enhance them, and as I said, there are a lot of opportunities to do this throughout the course of your doctoral studies. Also, experiential learning, that's where knowledge is created through the transformation of experience, is really useful also to your PhD. But I realize, many of you will not have the opportunity to do that, but it can be really, really effective, just that kind of experiential learning. It can really help you then to bring your PhD from a theory or from a concept, into a real world experience. Again, and we're just near the end now, disseminate your research as widely as possible. Try to get it published as far and wide as possible, because you'll find that very beneficial, and it will also help you in terms of growing as a researcher and enhancing your identity as a scholar and as a researcher. If you're struggling, and everyone struggles at some stage throughout their PhD, no matter how brilliant they are, but get help if you're struggling. And that could be help, from from the regional writing center here. It could be help in terms of just, working with your supervisor. It could be in terms of, say, formatting your thesis, dealing with a huge document. It could be that, you're having a lot of, mental health struggles. So, work with counseling, whatever it may be. Just make sure that if you are struggling in particular areas, that you do get some assistance or some help, and don't ever feel ashamed that you have to do so, because doing a PhD is a really hard thing, and everybody needs some help along the way, be it on the academic side or just on the whole personal care side. And the last one, and again maybe it's pertinent here, is knowing when to stop. There was a director of whose name I can't remember now, directed the film Australia, who said that I never finish a film, they always take it away from me. So, and he was like, well, what do you mean by that? He said, well, I'm never happy with my films when they're finished. I always feel that they could be much better. And so I think and this applies to people doing a PhD. Sometimes the most important thing is knowing when you should stop, when it is time to hand over the PhD. I think if I was in this situation, remembering back, I think I would still be trying to finish my PhD, because I would always find a flaw with something. I'd say, no, that could be better. That could be phrased a little better. I'd read back over the PhD and go, oh no, I should really have put this in. Oh, if only I had another week in which to do this. I have this, this new data. This would be great. I can get this in here. I also have, this article that I read, and I think, there's a line or two from this that could be really important in terms of, the literature review. It's so important that you know when to stop. So you have to find it. Again, this is another kind of aspect of discipline that you'll find very important when doing a PhD. When you're ready to submit, as I say, I think I felt I was never ready to submit my PhD, and as I said, given how many years ago it was when I submitted my thesis, I think I would still be there today, finding flaws and imaginary flaws in the PhD, and trying to improve it. So it's really important to know when to stop, and your supervisor should help you with that for sure. So the last thing I'm going to do is just to ask you, just to consider what do you think are the key elements for yourself of becoming a successful PhD researcher. So that's something perhaps for you to consider. That's something perhaps that we could discuss, or if any of you have anything that you want to put in the chat, you can do so. So I'm going to stop the recording, but what we will do is that we will continue with a short discussion about this. So if there's anything that you'd like to share, or anything that you put in the chat, we can talk about that. So I'm just going to stop here. I'm going to stop sharing. I'm just going to come back to you and just see if we have. I'm just going to stop that recording now. So I'm just going to say thank you all for your time and attention, and we'll just stop the recording and then just have a quick discussion. So thank you all.